Welcome to the last session. I know some people still will come in and walk in. Gosh, you're all still standing, that's quite good, or at least sitting down quietly. There is, well, this is the closing panel, and what we wanted to discuss today is something that some years ago very few people would pay attention to: trade. You know, it's like, as an economist 10, 15 years ago, if you worked on trade, like, why would you do that? You know, it's like there's nothing happening. WTO, it's deeply boring, we're sitting in lots of negotiations, nothing is happening. And then suddenly, you're the coolest kids in town. We have, of course, I think UK tried its very best to put trade back on the agenda by doing some very clever moves that are getting every day more interesting and more complicated, and God knows where we'll end. So that's at least my piece of advice: do take that plane out. But it's not just that. You know, global trade is also very much going through a kind of striking phase. You know, what initially looked like maybe just a temporary stagnation, since 2010, global trade is essentially being more or less stagnant. There's not been an obvious growth taking place. Now, that's another striking thing, is that trade is changing in terms of at least its growth rates. And so, you know, maybe it's also not surprising that you get phenomenon as we see the very eloquently expressed issues to do with trade by Mr. Trump and other things, but then actually we probably are in the middle of if it's not a real one, at least a phony trade war that is taking place between China and the US as well. And so these things are now coming up again. Now, we do this in the context of Africa, where, as usual, many of these conversations seems to be very far from very far from Africa's interest, or at least their interests are not necessarily taken into account. And so we thought it would not be a bad idea to actually have a panel here that actually talks about trade, African trades, in an age of trade turbulence. And of course, it's not that nothing is happening in Africa on this one. It is actually last year that the continental free trade area was agreed amongst, get the number right, Emily, you correct me, it was something like 44 countries or something. 52 apparently, led by a trade negotiation on WTO who came from Nigeria, and of course my favorite country for policy making didn't sign. Nigeria still hasn't signed, but still we're getting interesting things and why they're doing and how this is all playing out. And we thought that it would be a good idea to actually, from the point of view, seeing from Africa, where does trade stands for, what are the key issues, what are the challenges, what are the kind of issues that we may want to be thinking about in this context here as a closing panel. So we have three eminent speakers that are very well placed to talk about it. I will introduce them whenever I call them to the lectern to give their brief introductory notes. So they're each going to speak about 10-12 minutes. And the first person to do so is Emily Jones. Emily is an associate professor at the Blavatsky School of Government here, and she is actually someone who has worked for a very long time on trade in Africa and is in very high demand, including in Whitehall circles these days, and issues to do with trade negotiations. She has published widely around this area, and if I'm not mistaken, you're finishing a book around some of these issues as well. And I hope you will enjoy her first opening comments. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Stefan. Oops. Yeah. Great, so it's a real privilege and pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. As Stefan mentioned, so trade's back on the agenda, and at the Blavatsky School we hosted Susanna Malcora, who was the Foreign Affairs Minister of Argentina. And she presided over crisis talks over the WTO, and she's sort of very pessimistic about global trade. It's all fine because Africa's taking the lead. So it was a very sort of unusual moment where the world is really looking to the African continent. So I'm a political scientist, and I really focus on the politics of global trade and how developing countries maneuver within them. And what I wanted to do with my 10-12 minutes was to step back from some of the really dramatic headlines and look at some of the longer-term shifts, and then bring the sort of what's happening now into that longer-term context and put African countries within it. And I think as development economists, our policy community, we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we support development at the national level. So the big debates now about how do we integrate into global value chains, do we need a manufacturing-led development strategy, a services-led one, and that's all really important, right? Getting that sort of supply-side agenda sorted out. What I'm really interested in was what are the currents in the global markets? What is the nature of the global trading regime? Because that also has implications. Is there ultimately a market for those products to be sold into? So what are those big global trade changes? If you look at within African countries, a lot of the exports, for example, of textiles have been enabled by trade policies, actually. Right? So the EU and US having the African Growth and Opportunity Act in the US has opened its markets to textiles exports. That's helped propel exports, for example, from Lesotho, similarly the EU. So the global trade does matter for what goes on at a national level. So what are some of those really big trends? Stefan's mentioned, and I'll just put the graph up there. The big debate, I guess, in the global economy discussions is globalization stalled? Right, so for 20 years, this graph goes from 1980 right up to 2014. And we saw this, the top line there is global trade flows as a percentage of global GDP. And what you find is that trade in, so it's goods, services, and finance in aggregate. And it was sort of 20% roughly in the 1980s, went then all the way up to 53% of global GDP was the total volume of those cross-border flows. And we're now right down at sort of in the high 30s in terms of the percentage. And so we saw this huge trade expansion, which was really about global value chains expanding and sort of task-based production. We're seeing that slow down partly with the sort of onshoring of jobs and automation. Services linked to that slowdown, but also the decline in aggregate demand in OECD economies. Global finance has completely plummeted and not recovered post-financial crisis to anything like the flows it was at. So that's the context. But what's really interesting, and this was a McKinsey study from 2016, and their argument was, well, maybe not globalization is not stalled, it's just taking a very different, it has a very different nature. Because if you look at cross-border flows of data, that red line, that's not as a percentage of GDP, that's in terabits per second there on the right-hand scale, exponential growth, right? And the figures are really quite striking. So their argument, and you can see the African countries in this, is that what's happening is that global integration hasn't slowed down, but the nature of those global cross-border flows in the global economy are changing quite dramatically. And it's really data is where the new game is at. And I'm going to come back to that, because in the recent trade negotiations, we hear about tariffs a lot with all this trade war, but the big discussions about how do we regulate the global economy with regards to trade. Okay, so the recent USMCA, the renegotiated NAFTA agreement, big chapter on digital trade. Didn't get much airtime, but that's where the action's at. There've just been talks launched at the WTO, 70 countries on e-commerce cross-border data, and that's the big game in town. Right? If cross-border data is where a lot of the value is in the global economy, and so what are the rules that are going to govern that, and who's going to gain from it? And that's a point I'll come back to. The African continent, as I'm sure many of you know, just to put the data up there, we've seen 20 years of pretty rapid growth in exports, threefold growth more or less between the early 2000s and 2014, but really in extractives. Okay, so it's partly the more expansion of, we're exporting more extractives, but also the price. We had that commodity super cycle and that boom. So we've seen exports and a reorientation of African trade relations towards China. And you might have seen this was a couple of weeks ago in The Economist. But what's really interesting there, if you look at the percentage change in trade, so the dark blue one in the middle there is the total trade. So the EU is still the biggest trade partner outside of the continent, closely followed by China, but also India. Right? So India is really coming up quick as a new trade partner for the continent. So we've seen a quite a big structural shift. The US is much less important than it was. So those are the sort of shifting nature of trade partners. So just some thoughts then. What do these shifts in global trade mean? And then I'm going to talk about the global trade governance and the negotiations. Trade challenges. We have this huge slowdown of demand in the traditional markets. Right? So where you were really thinking about exporting to the US, to the EU, the markets are pretty stagnant. So it's there's not really that growth in demand there. Of course, there's a lot of growth in China, in India, but we've seen the risks of commodity-fueled growth and the jobless growth that comes with it, or the sort of jobless nature of that growth. China, again, at the moment, there are real concerns about a financial crisis in China. So there are interesting questions there about whether China's demand will be sustained. And I know there's already been discussion here, and I'm sure colleagues will talk about it as well. What is the future of global value chains and integration into global value chains? So there's a set of challenges that these big trends pose, but also some big opportunities, right? So there's this restructuring towards the global south, in particular within Africa. So the big gains to be had, if you like, where sort of the growth logic in the global economy and the big gains for African countries in particular are really going to come from African integration. And that's what's fueling the sort of the drive for the continental free trade agreement. And what's interesting there is that, as we all know, African countries trade relatively little with each other compared to, for example, the European Union, the ASEAN countries. And what's important from a development perspective is the higher value add in that intra-regional trade. Just to give you one statistic on that, so in 2014, manufactured goods were 41.9% of intra-African exports, but only 14.8% of extra-African. So where you're getting the value addition, it's sort of within the African continent. And I think what's interesting is we're seeing in a lot of different sectors now the emergence of Pan-African firms. That's quite a new trend, right, if you think of the last 20 years. So we're seeing it in banking, in retail. You think Dangote, he's sort of spread across the region. And I think, and I'll come back to this in a bit, that changes the politics of trade in the continent as well. New opportunities, I think, then in agro-processing. So the urbanization, I think, creates new opportunities there. If we think about just the number of people still employed in agriculture, I think we shouldn't forget that. Services, really interesting questions about which services. I've just been doing some work on financial regulation, and there's a lot of countries trying to position themselves as financial services hub for the region. Right? Ghana is, Nigeria is, Kenya is, Rwanda is. Not everyone can be a services hub. But also, I think there's an interesting question about how do you get financial services to really generate employment. So Ghana, for example, the government that's now ran on a manifesto that said we want to be like Mauritius or Singapore. Right? So I think it's a really interesting question about the role of that sort of financial services sector. And then crucially as well, the digital economy. If that's where the growth is at, if that's where we're seeing the big explosion, what does that look like? But then I wanted to come on to this question about how global trade and how we govern it is shifting and what that means for African countries. So we've seen the big trend here is we've seen a shift over the last 20 years in where trade rules are decided. And basically the WTO for a long time hasn't been the nexus of where decisions are made. All of the decision making has been at the regional level. So we've seen a proliferation of regional trade agreements. We now have 284 as at 2018. And that's really where the rules that govern trade are being decided. And we've seen a huge expansion of what goes into those trade agreements. So it was about tariffs, and the Brexiteers and the debate in the UK is still obsessed with tariffs, but that was the sort of 1960s, right? Actually, a lot of the 1970s was about removing borders to cross-border supply of services. We then were on to rules on intellectual property, removal of barriers to cross-border investment, and now, as I've mentioned, it's really about digital trade and e-commerce. And what I want to put it to you is some of the disruption that we're seeing in the OECD countries is about the scope of these trade agreements. So people are really feeling that now so much is up for grabs, and so many areas of policy are touched on by these often opaquely negotiated trade agreements. So that's the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership text, 5,000 plus pages of legal text. Like just the swathes, it's 29 different chapters, everything from government procurement to competition, it's all in there. So trade turbulence, it started before Trump. There was trade turbulence before Trump. If you were a trade nerd, you were watching. Protesters sort of abandoned the WTO, but they were there, right? So the Canada-Europe trade agreement was almost scuppered because the Wallonia, if you remember this small region of Belgium, because they were very concerned about the provisions, so people were on the streets. Trans-Pacific Partnership, there's people on the streets in Canada, in Japan. It almost didn't get ratified in Japan because the agricultural lobby was so concerned. Then, of course, we've had Trump on the back of the Rust Belt and deep concerns in the US, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. His new spat with China, I don't know if you've seen, but President Kagame's also had a bit of a spat as well with Trump. So Rwanda banned the import of used clothing to try and support the domestic textile industry, and President Trump then withdrew trade preferences. So there's a little bit, so Africa's had a little bit of a fallout, I guess, from the new trade politics. And then, of course, Brexit. So that's there, but I think it's a deeper, longer-term trend where I think people are asking for the global economy to be reconfigured, certainly in OECD countries. So all the polling data is that all the citizens in OECD countries have really lost faith with the globalization and the global economy. That's not the case for developing countries. So citizens in developing countries sort of are much more supportive of globalization. The WTO, there's a real existential crisis in the WTO at the moment. It might not be functioning at the end of this year. So we've had a stalemate in negotiations for sort of 15 years now. But the part of the WTO that functioned was the dispute settlement mechanism, okay, which is where you went if you had a complaint. And it's actually been pretty effective. We've had 544 cases since 1995, 350 rulings. We've basically got a system of global trade rules. At the moment, a lot of the US policy is in violation of those rules. The US is blocking the appointment of appellate body judges, which means that the dispute settlement, that rulemaking function, is likely to cease at the end of 2019. So there's a real question in a lot of people's minds as to whether we'll still have the sort of global trade system. So that's where we're at in the global trade, and Africa's not sort of necessarily featured strongly in that. But again, this is where the Susanna Malcora quote sort of came from. She's very excited about what's happening in the African region. So now that's the map of everyone who'd signed on to the Continental Free Trade Agreement at the end of 2018, which was 52 countries out of the 55, and 18 have now ratified. It needs 22 to come into force, so it should start being implemented. Very long transition period. Alongside, and it gets less attention, I guess, but there's a series of other initiatives, like the Open Skies, the Single African Air Transport Market Initiative, which again is to integrate the airspace across the continent. 28 have signed, only 2 implemented. Will they happen? So here I think there's a couple of things that are pushing the politics towards integration. The jobs imperative, I think, is enough of a political crisis for a lot of African leaders that they want to find ways to industrialize, to create jobs. That regionalization of firms that I talked about, you've now got regional firms that are pushing very hard for integration in the continent, but we have these tensions. Like Nigeria's not there for a reason. And it's not there because it's got quite a big manufacturing sector that's deeply worried. Right? And it's very easy to say, oh, Nigeria, yet again, they're not playing game. But actually, there's a lot of, there's a lot of inefficient or deeply concerned manufacturing companies that if they open up, they'll get wiped out. So whether or not the economics means that we shouldn't have them, the politics is such that they're going to stymie, I think, the opening up. So we've got to have a way of supporting those firms to adjust. So I think there's an interesting question there about how do we support countries to adjust in the manufacturing sector. And how do you open up? The airlines one, again, the reason that countries aren't implementing the airlines initiative is that they're worried that their domestic carriers will be undercut by carriers from other countries. So we've got to start grappling with this in the politics of it. Then and I'll wrap up with this slide. What about these big global trends then? What does it mean? for African countries. US-China trade war, yeah, it matters, but it's a kind of second-order impact for African countries. It's unlikely to directly implicate their trade flows. I think if it continues to dampen growth in China, that could have a knock-on impact. I think we do have to be aware of fragility within the Chinese economy. That could have very serious disruptive implications. Brexit, trade flows, a cursory glance says that it's 3% of sub-Saharan African exports come to the UK, so we're not a huge trade partner. A lot of that, though, goes to the Netherlands. So the Netherlands within Europe is the main destination, which makes me think that we're probably, couldn't find the data when I was looking, but I suspect a lot of the flows go to Netherlands and are then coming to the UK market. So I suspect that 3% is not quite right. But the main message there is Brexit's not going to disrupt hugely, for the continent as a whole, trade. But, and this is the but, the way that the UK imports products from African countries are through a series of trade agreements and trade preferences schemes that are under EU legislation. Okay, so there's a potential there for the disruption, and again, it matters for some products: tuna canning in the Seychelles, floriculture in Kenya, sugar in Mauritius. I know there's been people working very hard in the Department for International Trade and DFID to make sure that we've got mechanisms that are replicated, and I'm sure Nick can speak more to that. I know that the Seychelles and Mauritius have now signed an agreement with the UK to avoid trade disruption. So I'm not too worried about the disruption. Where I would love to see the UK go is to set a precedent. If we have Brexited, what can we do to support development? And so I've got some ideas about what that might look like in our external trade agenda, like happily to share in the discussion. But again, let's see. The domestic politics is such that I'm sceptical, but we have a history with DFID that I think we could capitalise on. We haven't talked much, but if you look to those trade flows, EU is a huge trade partner as a bloc for African countries. There's a big renegotiation of EU-Africa of trade relations and other relations that are going on at the minute. I think Carlos Lopez is heading for the African side. So again, interesting one to watch, but also India. India's coming up as a big, an important export market, but also a source of FDI. What's the strategy for that? And this is what I want to end on, is to say digital trade. So I mentioned earlier, this is really where the global economy is at. This is where the big global debate is at. African countries really aren't in that debate at the moment. So the rules are being written. At the moment, there's a big push, there's a big fight basically between the US, the EU and China about the nature of global trade regulations for digital trade. Developing this not really from a development perspective. So there's a really important bit of work, I think, on the research to be, which I know the Prosperity your Commission, the Pathways to Prosperity, is looking at, but we've got to link it with what's happening globally and think about what the global trade rules should look like that would facilitate harnessing that global digital trade. And lastly, I think for sure we're going to have to address tax and competition. Citizens in OECD countries are so frustrated that I don't think any longer we can neglect these questions about global tax cooperation. You've seen the rise of the big tech companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, others. There's a real question about competition policy. And again, we don't talk about these, but African countries need to have a united position on this. Illicit tax evasion by multinationals, perennial issue. We've finally got a moment globally where I think there'll be some momentum. What does the African continent want from that discussion? And I'm going to leave it there, but I think that's where the countries need to be focusing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. So I would like to move on straight to Nick. So Nick Lee is the Deputy Chief Economist at the Department for International Development at DFID. I can assure you that he is very well liked there, but also very influential, especially as on issues to do with trade, with macroeconomics, with influencing how issues and policy related to the economy in DFID are handled. So he spent a career doing all kinds of different things, including spending time in Malawi, I was a consultant for the World Bank, and it's probably the only one in the room who holds a patent for financial derivatives, and which is always a nice and remarkable detail. So Nick, please. Excellent.
Gosh. Bingo. Thank you. Everyone I've talked to so far at this conference has been interesting. It's been very clear the intellectual energy and commitment present in this group to support the development of Africa. And so, as an outsider and not as a regular attendee of your conference, I just wanted to say before I get started and get in trouble for saying controversial things, I really appreciate that commitment, and I really appreciate your intellectual energy, and so I just encourage you to carry on pushing. It's absolutely thrilling to be among it, and I wish I had had the opportunity to talk to more of you. Okay, so African trade in an age of global turbulence. Stefan gave us strict instructions to be controversial and disagree with each other. So far, I agree with absolutely everything that Emily said, so that's a real downer. Let's think a little bit about a recent turbulence. So, absolutely. So underpinning probably the whole thing is this big transition of China. By 2020, China is going to be, by 2020s, China will cross high income. By 2030, sometime in the 2030s, China will be a bigger economy than the US at market exchange rates. After then, you know, it'll be the dominant political hegemony, hegemon. Eventually, it'll be the dominant security hegemon. It's going to happen. So this big transition, the US trade war, is the first silo in a multi-decade transition. We can be sure of this. The slowdown in China hitting headlines, the OECD business cycle, clearly some economies are coming off their peak, Brexit, the fourth industrial revolution. This has made markets exceptionally jumpy. In November and December, the S&P 500 lost 15% of its value. Quite extraordinary. It prompted Robert Shiller, no less, to say, actually, this isn't driven by fundamentals, it's driven by contagious market narratives. He almost on the fly developed a new theory of rational expectations based around narratives, just because he simply couldn't explain what was going on. We're seeing a retreat from the trade war, and always the incentives were that way. Whenever anybody did a CGE model around the trade war, it looked like it was going to harm America at least as much as China, and if America, no matter what tactic America used, it was going to harm them more than third countries as well. So it looked like the incentives around the trade war were they were going to reach an accommodation, but we all know that Trump likes to use brinkmanship in his negotiations. If he was here, he would be threatening all of us with burning down the lecture theatre just in order to get a better seat or a glass of water. So we cannot take what Trump says at face value. We have to interpret his negotiating tactics. Right. So I kind of think that we have been overreacting, and instead of irrational exuberance, we've had a dose of irrational pessimism, which has made markets far more jumpy than they really are. And they've been around these factors that I outlined. I've lost count of the number of headlines that have said to me, this is proof that China is slowing. My goodness, it's been slowing since 2007. We all know it's been slowing, and it's right to slow. It has to slow. Here's a thing that you may have not picked up. If you disaggregate global growth by country contribution, it turns out that China has been the most stable contributor to global growth for the last 12 years. At market exchange rate, the world grows more or less at 3% per year. China contributes about 1% of that growth and has done pretty much since the global financial crisis and a little bit before that as well. So, surprisingly enough, I mean, this is official statistics, so, you know, but it's actually a rock-solid contributor to global growth. Despite the fact that its growth is slowing, because its growth is so high, it can slow and still contribute the same amount. So, everyone's been like answering the wrong question. It's not, is the Chinese economy slowing? It should be, is the contribution of China to the global economy falling? And it's not. Surprisingly, it's not. Even in the WEO projections for the next couple of years, we're not seeing that. It's interesting, as I said, the US-China trade war actually has some quite mild CGE effects on global growth. So the Asian Development Bank put it at minus 0.15% on global growth. There is a cyclic slowdown in the OECD, but last year we saw a cyclic peak. So, you know, it's going to happen. And there are a number of circumstantial factors as well. What's absolutely fascinating as far as Africa is concerned is look at the commodity outlook. The commodity prices are the principal transmission of global volatility to African economies, and the commodity outlook is remarkably stable. Commodities have fallen a little bit since the trade war, but are roughly back to sort of 2015 levels. What's also really interesting is that if you look at official Chinese statistics, its rebalancing is textbook on track. Demand shifting towards consumption, debt has probably peaked relative to GDP, lower reliance on exports as a growth driver, tighter regulation of shadow banking, even strengthening environmental regulations. So for me, the risk is not the observables, the risk is the unobservables. I think the very big short-term question is how much are China's official statistics totally fabricated and totally exaggerated. Now, it could well be that they are off by such a margin that we have an impending trade shock, commodity shock and financial shock waiting for us. But if you take the data at face value, in fact, pretty much all is going to plan. Okay, does Africa still need exports? Stefan wanted me to talk about this. And it kind of feels like preaching to the choir or going back to Eco 101. So I know you are all advanced level econometricians, but I kind of wanted to remind you of something that we see day in, day out at the coalface. And the first thing that it's not exports that matter, it's export value add. It's the net foreign exchange that exports generate. So, you know, less their imported components. So, for the remainder of these slides, a couple more slides, I'm going to talk about EVA. So, EVA growth is tremendously important. Why is EVA important? The first thing is because a constraint in EVA, in export value add, is a general constraint for the economy. For the obvious reason that every single sector of the economy has got a foreign exchange demand component. You're always going to need a little bit of imports, whatever it is you're doing. Exports are the only long-term growable source of foreign exchange. Now, there is one exception, and that is an economy that is lucky enough to have a very, very fast and enormous growing remittance supply. No economy that I know of is like that, apart from some economies in temporary stages. So, as your long-term foreign exchange supply, exports are the only game in town. Export value add is the only game in town. And it will impose a constraint on the rest of the economy. So, the critical thing here is that EVA has to be elastic to the real exchange rate. that if it does not grow in response to changes in the real exchange rate, you will get a growth constraint, whether you like it or not. So this is a fundamental Eco 101 export foreign exchange constraint proposition. Secondly, what's been incredible about exports is that they have been able to grow super fast over a very, very long period of time. So China and Vietnam posted a 20% annual growth over the 20-year period between 1990 and 2010. Absolutely extraordinary. 20% per year for 20 years. There is no possibility that endogenously driven demand could grow at that rate. So fast growth is only been historically possible through global demand harnessed by exports. And then the third point is that export growth very, very easily stimulates the rest of the economy. It tends to gear very, very quickly to everything else. So if you have got an export sector that is burning away, it doesn't stay contained within an export sector, for the obvious reason that as soon as an exports increase without anything else increasing, the real exchange rate is going to appreciate. The real exchange rate appreciates, imports are cheaper, imports grow. As imports grow, everything along the import logistic chain grows as well. Which lorry is going to move them around, which shop is going to sell them, which wholesaler is going to negotiate them. So you get a whole bunch of free, easy, lazy growth for nothing with an export boom. Now, this pattern confounds so many analysts that they look at a disaggregation of growth, they see a commodity price boom, commodities in real terms don't move very much, and they see a service boom, and they say, Africa must be transforming. And this was kind of behind the Economist's Africa Rising narrative back in whenever it was, 2010. There's very little structural transformation going. It's just a dead cat bounce of the service sector in response to a relative price change. What has constrained export value-add growth? I think it's a special case of a product which is neglected under traditional economic theory, that there are specific barriers for getting into export markets which don't exist in other markets. And these barriers are around the things I've listed here. So firstly, it tends to be a different product class. If you're in the OECD, your export stimulus is kind of beautifully controlled by Salter-Swan, real exchange rate rebalancing of tradable and non-tradables, and all you have to do is divert some domestic production to selling overseas. You don't necessarily even have to switch the type of product. For Malawi to suddenly switch, a firm in Malawi to suddenly switch from producing roofing materials for Malawian houses to something that exports is nearly impossible. There is a step change in production quality, step change in value for weight, higher regulatory requirements, more reliable quantity, the timings that you've got to deliver. You have to play a very different game to break into export markets. Trade transaction costs are the devil in the detail, that once trade transaction costs get too big, it's very, very difficult to export at all. And the high cost of establishing trust with foreign buyers. One of the things that I'm particularly very interested in at the moment in export promotion is the possibility of a UK import promotion agency. It's not Chatham House rules here, is it? Oh, it's live streaming here. In that case, I won't say what I was going to say. But just to say, it's unbelievable in this sort of rational world how it's very difficult to get past a mercantilist mindset. And despite the fact that everybody supposedly believes Ricardo, if you mention to policymakers, we really should be promoting imports. We should make it easier for African firms to broker trade deals with English firms, because of all these very, very nebulous, difficult barriers. And we recognise them in our own export promotion agencies. And yet it's hard to sell this. It is very hard to sell this. Anyway, commodity dominance is a problem. Emily's mentioned this. This is a graph, actually, down on the bottom left-hand side, right-hand side. If you net out intra-African exports, so there's an awful lot of re-exports, stuff that comes into Tanzania gets, passed on, and there's an awful lot of regional ISI. So if you took sub-Saharan Africa, less South Africa, as a single country, and worked out what it trades with the rest of the world, it's amazing how commodity dominated it is. So it's even more pronounced than the graph that you had. In fact, it's hydrocarbon dominated. So more than 50%, actually just coming up to 50% of what the world buys from sub-Saharan Africa is actually just oil. So that's really interesting. I think the real exchange rate, management of the real exchange rate in Africa is really, really interesting, in that it's not functioning as a responsive policy instrument. Now, there's a whole load of people whose eyes glaze over when we talk about the real exchange rate, but it's staggeringly damaging when it doesn't function as it should. And it doesn't function as it should because countries strategically overvalue as a nominal price anchor, or remittances, commodities, and, dare I say it, aid, especially aid used for consumption, overvalues, and the institutional failures that we all know about. So this is my last slide, which will be done in 30 seconds flat. So what next? What next? We can't do without exports. So just that argument that, whether you like it or not, that foreign exchange supply forms a ceiling on growth rates. So you have to have it. It is the heartbeat of an economy, whether you like it or not. Roderick's manufacturing productivity escalator, when you think about it, what was it based on? It was based on these two things, of A, that manufacturing could absorb unskilled labour, and secondly, that it offered a dense, traversable product set. And what I mean by that, it had a product set that a factory could upgrade to the next adjacent product with slightly higher productivity, and so keep on its productivity run. And that allowed, intensive margin and extensive margin growth. So the worry, the really big sort of killer at this, is that the fourth industrial revolution may mean that mass unskilled labour is inefficient for export manufacturing at any exchange rate. And the thought experiment on this is there anything that you can manufacture on the moon? That the transaction costs, the trade transaction costs of getting to the moon are so astronomically high. There's only a certain set of goods that you could possibly buy from the moon, and they are the set of goods that are geographically determined by the moon. So you could only buy moon rocks from the moon or moon tourism from the moon. You could not buy any process that could be manufactured on Earth on the moon because of trade transaction costs. So the nightmare of the fourth industrial revolution is that it turns Africa into the moon, because it would increase the weighting of trade transaction costs in the production cost calculation, because unskilled labour would decrease as a weighting. Now, the hope is that digital service exports, and as Emily was talking about the data flow, could provide a labour-absorbing traversable product set. So that's my patented 5-word acronym. And I think that's shorthand for get out of poverty, get out of low income fast. You need a labour-absorbing traversable product set. And the weird thing is that it could be things like remote service avatar, a robot piloted by someone in Ghana who cares for the elderly, or does whatever you can get a robot to do. Creative industries. I think the fallback is geographic comparative advantage, which is kind of happening already: mining, specialised agricultural tourism. And there's always these slower growth drivers. There's always high-skilled exports, which we're seeing a little bit of, but are going to be slow burners. And then my parting shot for you is my piece of technological pessimism, which is there may well be a whole load of things that machines can't do. People that don't understand AI and don't understand the fourth industrial revolution can easily over-extrapolate its capabilities. We may well be pleasantly surprised by what machines can't do, and the manufacturing, or a subset of the manufacturing escalator, remains available for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Made a seamless link to Sunday's opening panel with some similar links there, and I think also Emily had alluded to it. And so I just want to make sure I understood your point, but you are saying that Whitehall and other people there do not like the idea of an export promotion agency for mercantilist reasons.
Are you putting me on the spot here, Stefan?
Sorry, import promoting agency for Africa for mercantilist reasons, yes. Okay, you don't have to answer it. We can tweet that.
I'm having some trouble with it.
We can have the last but not least here, definitely. So it's really great that Albert agreed to join us here. So Albert Zeufack is the World Bank's chief economist for Africa. He's a long-standing friend and colleague of CSAE, working with many of us over the many years. And so, please, Albert, share us your thoughts here as well. Before then, we can go to some extensive Q&A. Thank you.
Yep. So, friends, two preliminary points. One, my name is Albert Zeufack, as you have seen, so I'm used to speaking last. The alphabet has some good things, about, having a name starting with Z. The second preliminary point, when I took over as chief economist for Africa, I actually launched two big regional studies on trade on Africa. One on market access in troublous time, and second, a study on integrating global value chain. And results of those studies are now coming to the market in form of working papers, and reports are coming out. So this is just a sign that economists sometimes have perfect foresight. So let me start by, really acknowledging the CSAE for organizing this great conference and for picking this extremely important team for this conference and for the end of this panel. I know my job is to keep you awake, keep you interested. This is the last panel. So let me try to be a little bit more provocative. So what you have here is clearly the sign that we are living in real times of trouble, If you look at the chart on the upper right panel, this is the declining trend of average import tariffs in the US since the 40s. And if you look at those dots, the orange dot is actually where the US is considering raising tariffs back to. So if that were to happen, if the trade wars was to really take full effect, tariffs in the US would probably be back to the levels of the 70s. This is trouble. Second, what is quite interesting is that the panel, the left panel is showing you that all that trouble is actually happening while this has nothing to do with growth. To the contrary, over the years, and this is basically telling you that countries that have reduced their tariffs have tended to grow. So there's this positive association between change in average tariffs and annual GDP growth. And what is also interesting here is that that protection and that war, interestingly and thankfully, is now taking place just between two big economies. And I don't think I can use the pointer here, can I? Okay, good. So the trade war is actually taking place between the United States and China, which are certainly two of the largest. But what is quite interesting is that the rest of the developing world is not partaking yet. And the rest of the world is actually what is driving global growth. So there is some interesting point there, which is if that was to be contended, there will be repercussion, including on Africa, but probably not to the point that it's being anticipated. But when I look at this chart, one thing that really struck me is the following, and that's the first message I want to leave you with. If protection or the rising of protectionism has nothing to do with growth, then what does it have to do with? And the answer is political economy, expletive, right? Political economy, and as we as a profession rediscover trade, I think we need to really put a little bit more focus on the political economy of trade. There will be losers and winners from trade, and we cannot just take it for granted. We have to move beyond growth as the only way to measure the impact of trade. We have to, especially we in Africa, as we are now leading the world in, trade, and Africa is showing how we can integrate and use trade as a global, as an engine of growth. As we embark on this African continental free trade agreement, we need to make sure we do not forget the political economy. Some countries may lose, some may win, and we have to address this right from the beginning. We're doing some work on assessing the distributional impact of the continental free trade agreement that we are sharing with the African Union and the UN ECA, and I think this is frankly something we cannot forget. So that's the first message I wanted to share with you. Now, despite all those tensions, I think it's important and reassuring to see that trade is still driving growth. Trade is still driving growth, and it's even the case for Africa. My colleague Cesar Calderon just finished a paper that actually shows that if you look at the past 10 years, import diversification or trade diversification has actually led to an increase in productivity, an increase in growth, and this is, coming out of a very, very serious work. Now, moving to the next, what Stefan has asked me to do for this panel is, and he warned me, this is not an academic panel, this is a policy panel. It's to actually discuss manufacturing. Is there still any potential for manufacturing? So what I'm going to do is to address what I believe are two myths or puzzles, as I would call them. The first puzzle is that Africa is deindustrializing prematurely. The second is that it is too late for Africa to integrate global value chains. So, manufacturing global value chain. So I'm going to address this, and my answer to both questions is maybe not and no, absolutely not. Then I'll end my presentation by discussing quickly three pathways that could boost African trade, because I fundamentally believe trade will remain an engine of growth for Africa. One, we will have to foster regional value chains, probably as a way to better integrate global value chains. Second, we'll have to harness the digital revolution and hopefully to boost not only productivity of other sectors, including manufacturing, but also to boost trade in services. And third, it would be important to strengthen the link between research and trade policy. Now, let me start with, manufacturing. You probably read of this quote by Mark Twain. I can understand perfectly how the report of my illness got about. I have even heard on good authority that I was dead. The report on my death has been greatly exaggerated. When I read that, I thought that was exactly what's happening with manufacturing. The report of manufacturing death or premature death have been grossly exaggerated, especially when it comes to Africa. And the following slides, I hope, will convince you so. Now, premature industrialization is about, manufacturing sector shrinking at levels of income that are much lower than those it happened in advanced economies. And the seminal paper on that literature is Roderick, 2016. But when I took a second look at that paper by Rodrigue, what was quite interesting is that the Africa Rodrigue is talking about is actually 11 countries. And if you remove Mauritius, the results are no longer robust. So we started to really question and wonder if we could actually have a result that really speaks to Africa, as a whole, or at least broaden that sample. We've built probably what I believe is the longest panel I've seen on output and employment shares for 41 sub-Saharan African countries from 1960 to 2016. So we've run some regressions, fixed effects, fractional logit, and our results do not necessarily support Rodrigue's. What we find is basically that the majority of African countries have actually had a stable level of industrialization over time. And, if you look at the means of the share of manufacturing value added in GDP for 6 decades, what we find is 17 countries have actually, clearly had stable shares of manufacturing value added in GDP. 10 countries have experienced decline, for sure. 7 others have actually shown increase in their manufacturing value added. And most of these countries are in East Africa, as I'll come back to it. So what is quite clear from what we're finding is that it's grossly misleading to lump Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa for that matter, into a single category. What we find, it's obvious clearly to say Africa is not a country, but it's just so glaring how much our results in development in Africa are tainted by that lack of consideration of heterogeneity across countries. So what we have done is to show here that manufacturing output shares actually vary tremendously by resource endowment, vary by region, and only the West African region displays the inverted U curve that is anticipated by the theory, and the rest of the countries clearly do have different trends. So as you can see, East Africa is certainly the region where you have a clear positive association between positive growth in manufacturing out share. So one other very important point is when we instead of using GDP, we use non-GDP, non-oil GDP, then the patterns of industrialization are completely different. So I think it's clearly speaking to the resource curves and others, but I think it's important to account for this when we are discussing manufacturing trends in Africa. And if you look at employment shares, we do not find the inverted U either. As you can see from these regressions, the coefficient on your quadratic term here is clearly not negative. As you can see there, is quite positive. Okay, so let me move, to the second puzzle, which is, global value chain. Can Africa still integrate manufacturing global value chain? We heard from the first session, how technology is actually threatening manufacturing and how it is difficult. But what we are finding is clearly that sub-Saharan Africa countries are actually integrated into global value chains, across different groups. Obviously, natural resource-rich countries are less integrated into manufacturing global value chain than in the 90s. And we also have, most importantly, that non-oil resource-rich are integrating even more than their comparators, including some Asian countries. So, this chart precisely is breaking down participation in global value chains into backward and forward linkages. And what is quite clear here, and the problem here, is that most of the participation in global value chain in African countries is actually coming from forward linkages, which is basically driven by oil-rich countries contributing to other countries' exports. for example, exports of natural gas that feed into fertilizers, in India that are then exported back to Africa. This is how Africa is integrating, and it would be actually extremely useful if African integration into global value chain was through backward linkages, which is actually where there is potential for job creation within the continent. So, employment, as I've said, participation in global value chain is actually creating net job growth. If you look at this data from, between 2000 and 2014, and we are actually using firm level data for at least 7 African countries to really document this very, very properly. This is a study that we are completing. The task team leaders were here probably in this conference, Tai Mengiste and Emmanuel Latte. This report is coming up, and we are certainly going to be sharing a little bit more. Now, let me quickly discuss 3 pathways. One is regional integration. This chart is actually from a report by the African Development Bank, which is showing different dimensions of integration. Yes, we all know, integration is low, but what is quite interesting here, though, is to see that, the only dimensions where, the West African community, ECOWAS, is very, very, prolonged is the free movement of people. And I think this is a very interesting one. They have an ECOWAS passport now, which is now being emulated at the African Union level. So if that could happen, definitely the free movement of people would help regional integration in Africa. So Central Africa is certainly not performing that well. And, as you can see here, the dark line, they have the financial and macroeconomic integration, mostly because of the franc zone. But other dimensions of integration are clearly lagging. Integration institutions, regional institutions in East Africa are certainly performing better, as we can see here in this chart for EAC. Very good. So the second pathway, well, what I would probably want to say here is that, as we move and implement the African continental free trade, there is room for, strengthening regional value chains. Yes, countries like Nigeria are, reluctant to sign, but the issue here is not basically tariffs, it's rules of origin. Countries like Nigeria would resent the fact that Benin, in the agreement, can actually import whatever they want from China and flood the Nigerian market, for example. So the question we need to be looking at more closely is that of the rules of origin. And I think in that context, if we could look at it more seriously, we could help African countries negotiate a better agreement. But fundamentally, the African continental free trade can allow, the strengthening of regional value chains that could then help the continent access and improve on, access more global value chain and create employment for the youth. The next pathway, I believe, is to harness the power of the digital economy. And at the World Bank, our new strategy for the Africa region has a central pillar on the digital economy, and we call it the digital moonshot. Nick, we won't buy anything from the moon, but we definitely want to shoot, really high, and for our, for our populations to actually be digitally enabled. Firms, governments, and individuals, we are hoping we can actually work with countries to make that connectivity effective by 2030. And we do have, intermediate targets. We are working both with the Africa Union and the UNECA to make sure we achieve this digital moonshot. And the pillars of our moonshot are clearly to put in place a clear regulatory framework for the digital economy for Africa. And this is also connected with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. These have to go in pair. Digital infrastructure is critical, and I'm sure most of you or some of you have read this paper in the American Economic Review last month, showing how the cable, the submarine cable in East Africa has actually led to more job creation, not more job displacement, has led to actually more employment in manufacturing firms, both skilled and non-skilled. That paper is actually really challenging most of the doomsayer or naysayer about, technology and manufacturing jobs or jobs in Africa. So it's actually important for us to make sure we complete the digital infrastructure in Africa. And to complete digital infrastructure, we definitely have to complete the other unfinished agenda, which is the physical infrastructure, especially power. There will be no digital infrastructure without power. And we just finished a big report in my office on electricity access, and I can tell you, number of African countries are still below 15% of access to electricity. That would have to be done if we are to boost trade. Other pillars include the skills, of course, digital skills, digital platform, and the focus on digital entrepreneurship. Last but not least, I think one of the things missing in Africa in our policy making is the link between research and action. What is missing, including in trade policy, and I've been discussing with a number of people who are part of the trade negotiation teams. Very few of these trade negotiators are using your work. Very few of them are even aware that you guys have been working and publishing on these questions. Which begs a big question. Why do we do this if we cannot seize this opportunity to influence the debate? So, one of the initiatives I took when I became Chief Economist of the Africa region is to create this platform. It's called Think Africa. And the objective is to really, create that bridge between evidence and policy making across Africa. One of the pillars of this is to actually get the chief economic advisors of government to start talking to each other, having that, peer learning mechanism. And I'm really proud to say that we have now launched that platform last month here in Oxford. And thank you, Stefan, and others for contributing to it. So we need to make sure, we strengthen the link between analysis, research, and trade policy making on the continent. So with this, let me stop here and looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. So we have a bit of time for some Q&A. We've covered quite a lot of ground here, starting from trade and global issues to do with trade, and maybe where Africa fits into issues to do with the role of trade and exports and where it may go further. And also then I'll bear talking about some of these things, but also digging a bit further into where some of the future opportunities and indeed how World Bank and others are trying to make this happen. So, open for any questions. We'll see whether we can get some structure and order in it. And yes, so I see there, and then we'll go there as well. So. Okay. So let's take about 3-4 questions first round. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of the talks. I really enjoyed them. My name is Angela. I'm a Malawian national from Yokohama National University. I have 2 quick questions. The first one was, I just wanted to hear your thoughts, because I think during the talk I wanted to hear something concerning exchange rates. So when we talk about intra-African trade, we know that almost all of the countries in Africa already belong to at least 2 regional economic communities. And when we look at at least in the case of Malawi, I don't know about other African countries, when we look at trade from within Africa, about 56% or so is invoiced in the dollar, and trade from China is like 90% invoiced in the dollar. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the effect, the exposure to a dollar-dominated economy that we're in. That does it matter in the end? Isn't Africa still exposed to all of this turbulence going on because of the dollar-dominated economy? Thanks.
Very good. Okay. There.
Thank you for the presentations. Belinda Archibong. I am an economics professor at Barnard College, Columbia University in New York. So one of the things that I always kind of wonder about when we hear the trade discussions that I don't hear as much about is this issue of climate change, right? So we talk about climate change as the biggest market failure of them all that we really don't talk about as much as we should. And so one of the questions that I have is trying to understand, we talk about African countries as being are going to be the most vulnerable, the most exposed populations going forward from climate change and global warming. And one of the things that we talk about in environmental economics is countervailing tariffs, right? So to address transboundary pollution. So it's not first best, it's not necessarily efficient, but in a kind of a scenario where you are part of a group of countries that are among the most vulnerable, and yet you don't have as big a stage as a China or the US or even an EU in these types of kind of carbon tax, climate change discussions. Are countervailing tariffs then ever a kind of recommended option? They're not first best, true, but theoretically they can address kind of reducing pollution or reducing this kind of transboundary pollution for affected countries going forward. So I don't know if that's a conversation that's happening in this trade world. I'm coming up from the environmental economics world, so I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts on this, if this is ever a strategy in terms of trying to address this, the kind of vulnerabilities faced by African countries from climate change.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. My name's Hannah. I'm from the Centre for Global Development. I had a question for Emily. You mentioned that you thought that Brexit was an opportunity for the UK to set a precedent in pro-development trade policies. I think the UK government has said that in the first instance they intend to replicate the EU's preferential trade arrangements and make improvements later. What improvements do you think the UK should prioritise?
Okay, so why don't we, Emily, do you want to start with that? Sure. And then we'll...
Great, thank you very much. So just on that question, I think there are a series of relatively small things that the UK could do in terms of its, like the preference scheme. So essentially the EU's been pretty good actually on the development agenda. And so bringing that over is the first good starting point. There is the sort of trade frictions, so this idea of an import promotion agency is a really interesting one. So some of the things around rules of origin, countries graduate out of schemes, there's a lot to find. Basically the devil in the detail of how these preferences schemes work would be one option. With regards to, I think, our free trade agenda going forward, so say we Brexit, it's all so much up in the air, but if we've got autonomy over our external trade policy and we're negotiating as the UK with developing countries a free trade agreement, then I think there's lots up for grabs. So then you've got chapters on investment policy, labour standards, environmental standards, and I think you could do some really interesting rethinking. One idea would be to have a chapter on tax cooperation, right, in a free trade agreement, where the UK commits to sharing and supporting. So, for example, if we've got mining companies operating in the African region, to be much better about sharing data and cooperating so that the tax avoidance can be clamped down on. So that type of, or transfer pricing, I think there's an interesting sets of issues that we could get into. More my concern is whether the politics is going to stack up. At the moment, I think there's a scepticism about the whole UK aid agenda. DFID is sort of the squeeze is being put on, I think, the development agenda by a lot of, certainly the Conservative Party. So a lot that could be done, and I think the question is what the politics might do. Just quickly on the climate one, my experience of the trade world and the climate world is they still are in totally different silos, and they're begging for somebody to do the work to join them up. So, for example, at the WTO, we've already had cases brought, for example, on subsidies for solar panels. So the trade world is not, the rules that we have in the trade world in the WTO are not set up very well to support the types of measures that the climate agenda is leading us towards in the sort of, so the huge amount of work could be done, I think, very productively there.
Albert, do you want to come in?
Very quickly on the on Angela's question on exchange rate, I think it's a very important one, and I think what is at stake here is how much dollars do we get from export, right? Yes, we do import in US dollars, but how much market access do we have that could actually allow our countries to probably rack in more USD. And I think, you know, as we revisit the trade agenda, those questions of market access have to come back to the table. You know, I've been reviewing AGOA, for example. And it does happen that, you know, broadly, AGOA hasn't helped that much African countries apart from oil exporters. You can actually safely say AGOA actually helped the US import oil from Africa easily. But when it comes to non-resource exports, AGOA has probably helped Lesotho. And over the past 10 years, Kenya and Ethiopia are now really taking advantage of AGOA. But the rest of African countries, Central and West Africa, have completely failed to take advantage of it. To me, these are all opportunities to access the US market and bring in dollars that would be helpful to service our imports. But yes, you know, it would definitely be you know, more interesting for countries like Malawi to build those reserves and maintain them so that you don't miss the opportunity to import necessary goods. But when I look at reserves across Africa, when you look at reserves, you know, the situation is also quite alarming. So it's not only about trade, it's also about sound monetary and exchange rate policy. Thank you.
Nick, do you want to comment on exchange rate policy?
Yeah, sure. I don't think invoicing matters. You can invoice in the Indonesian ringgit. What matters is forward contracts. So if you invoice in dollars and your dollar payment is 6 months ahead, then you carry that dollar risk. So the place where forward contracts are the most acute is in debt. So it really, really matters what your debt is denominated in. It's all about the time structure of that. On climate change, you know, nearly 50% of what the world buys from Africa is oil. So, yeah, it's going to have a massive follow-through. I couldn't agree more. And on Hannah's, from CGD's question about you know, what could, you know, a super post-Brexit policy do? Here's one that's really bizarre. So we've got the EU has got concessional tariff schedules which move up from everything but arms, EBA for least developed countries. It moves up to something called the General System of Preferences, GSP. And then for a bunch of countries that sign a whole load of commitments to being good, it's got something called GSP Plus, which is for lower middle income countries, which and it releases quite a high proportion of their tariff lines. So bizarrely, we punish badly behaved countries by not allowing them to diversify. And when you think of the political economy of that, it's completely upside down. We should punish bad economies by helping them diversify, because diversification contains the seeds of their totalitarian reform. So we can certainly, theoretically anyway, we could revisit the incentives that trade policy sets.
So, and I just want to add, not putting Nick on the spot, is that it was very striking at the moment of Brexit that for most people, of course, everything that Europe, if you were a Remainer, everything that Europe does is good. It's not so obvious that in terms of trade policy, Europe was that good for Africa. And so there were definitely lots of people in Whitehall, if only there had been a bit of the bandwidth to do some of the things that Emily and Nick is talking about. So we live in hope, because there is a lot of good thinking, good thought being put in it, and actually if anything good could come out of it, and so on. Let's go to some more questions. Augustine there.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. Albert indicated earlier that Roderick was wrong. Roderick was wrong.
Roderick was wrong.
Yes. Yeah, sure. 2016 paper about premature deindustrialization, right? Well, Roderick more recently has indicated that perhaps there's no African growth miracle. And two reasons are cited. The first one has to do with commodity prices and the fact that the boom will not be sustained. And the second one has to do with unusually low interest rates globally. What do you think? Is he wrong again? Thank you.
Right. That's interesting because I think on Friday other people were saying Roderick is wrong. So someone should tweet it, maybe ask him. It's the only thing. Any more questions that we could take? Oh, sorry, there on the front. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Frederick. I'm based at University of Dodoma in Tanzania. I had a small question for Albert Zeufack. You mentioned about the Digital Moonshots initiative, and I can understand the first two strands on legal regulatory framework and digital infrastructure. So when you talk of specifics of the latter three, the digital skills, platform, and entrepreneurship, what exactly do you have in mind? Like, are you into opening up schools or funding schools to train what you consider digitally skilled graduates? Are you into, you said you want to double the number of online services, the index rating. Is it because you're already targeting some of those online companies in Africa, or I just want to get more into specifics? So related to that, this initiative at this time of the era, it's coming. Is it because you believe Africa has an edge or comparative advantage in the digital trade? I just want to know a little bit about the specifics, and then more into why do you think this is the right time for Africa? Is there some analysis that's showing we have a comparative advantage on that? Thanks.
That's the final question there.
Thank you very much. My name is Ferdinand Ogunji from the University of Yaoundé too. My question is to Mr. Zeufack. I want to know, what do you think about the issue of the higher tariffs in African countries compared to other developing countries, and how they can deal with this issue, knowing that tariffs are an important part of government resources in these countries? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we're coming close to the end, so I'm going to let whatever you want to answer as questions, you can do this, but also...
They're all for Albert.
We give you... Yeah, I know. But I also want each of you, maybe, if you could get in one line what we should research on this kind of topic that you had, and then maybe secondly, if you have any final point, any insight, any policy insight that you want to communicate, also feel free to do. So you're allowed to say two things, although Albert can start and answer all these questions as well.
So, since I have no co-author here to send the tough questions to, I'll try. Augustine, thank you so much for your question. Look, I think Roderick's paper on deindustrialization, my view, is that it has been just taken for granted. It's just been, accepted. And I thought it was important to actually just question it. And the moment we started scratching, we're not finding evidence, really strong evidence to support that. That's the only thing I'm saying, right? So, and in our careers as researchers, certainly we have been wrong, I don't know how many times, but for me, I know I've been wrong a lot of time. But I think, again, it's not about being right or wrong. It's about building evidence to support or reject, an idea, right? A hypothesis. And for now, we are not finding that strong evidence. Hopefully, we can document this a little bit even further in the future. On growth, yes, I've seen, number of, views on the fact that, yes, African growth of the past 20 years was essentially the the result of the commodity super cycle. And yes, when you purge the commodity super cycle, growth from other sectors was definitely not that high across Africa. So, again, it's not about being right or wrong. It's about really getting, into further understanding of growth dynamics in Africa, and we all have to do that. So I don't think we should be afraid of, getting results that may contradict, other colleagues. So I think there's a point about saying that African growth was clearly, commodity, but also availability of financing conditions globally due to the accommodative monetary policy in the US that led to very, very low interest rate globally, right? So yeah, of course, we can certainly argue that. On the digital moonshot, I think I would certainly need a whole session that Stefan wouldn't give me to actually really get into the detail of all the, the pillars of the digital moonshot. But what we are saying, very, very interesting question you have here is why now? And does Africa have an age? And the answer is yes. If you just look at what has happened in Kenya, Kenya has, in the space of 10 years, become the world leader in financial inclusion, essentially leveraging this digital revolution. And I think it's about time to really start, understanding what took place in Kenya, how we can actually replicate it across Africa, and how we can actually sustain that success in Kenya. What's happening is actually technology is now at a point in Kenya that is opening new areas, new sectors or new activities in the economy that none of us could have, predicted. And I think that's what happens because all the debate about technology and what would happen to Africa tends to really exaggerate the negative impact in the short run and underestimate the positive aspect in the long run. So I think is the time right? Yes, it is. And my sense, visiting Africa, and believe me, I do travel extensively on the continent, is that the digital economy has already taken, root, and it's moving. And either we get on board or we will be obsolete. So I think it's really important for us to see how we can work with countries to really harness this revolution that is taking place. Last question, Serge. High tariff and domestic revenue mobilization. It's important that African countries certainly have fiscal consideration or fiscal constraints in mind when they are liberalizing. But when you look at the structure of fiscal revenues in our countries, the taxes from trade have actually declined significantly over time. It's actually, the very, very small portion of fiscal revenue. So, taxation from trade is definitely not what should keep our ministers of finance worried overnight. It has declined significantly. It's not negligible, maybe for some countries in Africa. And that's where we probably need to, discuss as part of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, just to come back to the point I made earlier, possible compensation mechanisms, for countries that may actually lose fiscal revenues. The work we have done in the bank, in the Trade Department, and that we share with the UNECA and the African Union last month is showing that there are probably only 5 countries in Africa that could worry about fiscal, about revenue losses from the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Not that many. But for those, I think it's important to really start thinking what will be the right compensatory mechanism. So that would be my answer. And if I may close on Stefan's question, we are starting a large research project on the digital economy. Because you are absolutely right, you're absolutely right. Most of the targets we have there are to help countries that want to embark on, make it happen. Countries that want to reform their curriculum, our education colleagues will come in and see what kind of soft skills are actually needed for the digital economy to prosper. For countries that want to really get into creating tertiary education institutions that would probably boost the number of engineers or others, yes, the World Bank would be happy to help. So it's not about the World Bank, going and building universities or doing stuff. It's about helping countries that want to get into, to harness this wave, to ride this wave to actually make it happen. So researching on what the digital economy may bring to Africa is certainly one area that we are trying to learn more on. And one area that has been very, very close to my heart for a long time is the area of firms' dynamics in Africa. Despite all the efforts over the past 20 years, we still haven't actually built the right data sets that allow us to understand, firm creation, firm entry and exit, firms, growth in Africa in a way that would really help in the discussion on job creation in Africa. To me, this is still an agenda for future research. Okay, thank you.
Nick, maybe?
Yes, thank you. I know it's getting late. On the Roderick paper, I had the privilege of being his commentator when he came to present it in London. And it was obvious right from the start that, the thing had enormous holes in it. Zambia was classed as prematurely deindustrializing when all Zambia's industrialization was ISI. It was, and just so the withdrawal of the ISI policy, of course, made it deindustrialized. But it was absolutely clear it wasn't a fair shot. It wasn't under stable competitive conditions. Higher tariffs. Dare I say it? The world is currently at a point where we are re-examining the doctrine of free trade. Collier's book and noises from all sorts of sources. For the first time in 2 decades, we might be able to say that some tariffs might not be wicked. And I think that's right. So an intelligent reassessment of the role of tariffs in transformation is, worth a crack. Maybe things are too early for that, but, whisper its name. Right, what should be researched? Okay, again, I'm going to dare to say this. My wife told me not to. I think that you guys need to find out a way of breaking the chains imposed by journal gateways. I've listened to about 10 papers today. Every single paper is constrained by having to have a regression in it. And it's really just an enormous, dolled up regression. The problems that Africa needs solutions to, most of them are not amenable to closure from a regression. There is simply not the data, and there is simply not the simplicity of causality. You have to find ways of making an intellectual input as economists on deeper problems that cannot be closed just by pressing a button on Stata. Stata is constraining this profession, and it's constraining its contribution to African development. I really think you need to have a serious conversation with journal gateway holders to say that it is limiting our ambition and actually making our work timid and sometimes irrelevant. Okay.
So
on the basis of that, this is what I would like you to look at. We need to know much more about the constraints to non-extractive export growth and non-extractive FDI. We need to be all over that problem. We need to have a much better understanding of the dynamics of fragility and of how countries exit fragility. We are still groping about in the dark on that. We need to have a much better handle on the evolution of non-developmental elite bargains. Most African countries are constrained because of a non-developmental elite bargain. It's a fact of life, but it's not static. It will move. What makes it move? And I agree with Patrick, I agree with Albert that please can we get some more data on firm dynamics, firm size, and employment. So that's me.
Thank you, Nick. So it's nice to hear for the very last time at our conference.
Thank you for inviting me, Stefan.
I've listened to your wife.
Great. I heard there a plea for a bit more political economy analysis in that last statement. So that's my area of work, and I think there's a huge amount of rich research to be done on the politics of a lot of these questions, the politics of industrialization. I think, particularly in the sort of trade policy or global economic policy space, digital trade, how we harness it from a sort of ground up, but then think about the rules that govern it and making sure they're not written somewhere else. So really thinking about what are the rules for cross-border data flows. They are being written, and I think for us as researchers to understand what the development trajectory needs to look like and then to really input into that debate. Similarly on tax and on competition policy. So those are the policy areas I think need work and analysis. On the digital, to put a little bit of a gloss of sort of pessimism perhaps on all the optimism, it's just the quality of jobs in the gig economy. I mean, we're seeing it here, and I think there's a real question about the quality of jobs that are going to come from that. We're seeing in this country very insecure informal contracts, and I think the nature of labour markets, they could go very similar ways. So how do we, and maybe that's more of a policy question than a research question, but how do we actually strengthen the erstwhile labour movements that have declined, and the voice of workers actually in the new digital economy space? The answers aren't obvious, but I think we need to think quite carefully about the quality of those jobs and how we shore them up.
Good. Okay, I think we are coming here to the end of this session. So I'm going to ask you not to disappear, although I'm going to close this session, but I think Simon will probably assisted by, or not, yes, assisted or not, will then close the conference formally. But I just want to actually, so I suppose I should briefly emphasize, so Nick was my deputy when I was chief economist at DFID, but I didn't select him, okay?
He's decided
I just want to make sure that's clear on the record. Well, anyway, we worked together extremely for a very long time, and it's great to be challenged on all these things. And in fact, also, I want to thank Nick, and I want to thank also Albert and Emily for the contributions to these panels. I definitely learned a couple of things, even in things that I always been good to remind it, you know, like Nick's picture of what actually Africa sells to the world. How limited that still is in terms of diversification away from minerals. I thought Albert's picture there is that, you know, if you think Africa is leading the way on certain thing, it's very striking that in terms of movement of people, that actually Africa has always been very striking. Goods are far harder to move than people, which is not usually the political economy discussion that we tend to have in our countries. Think of this one again. And then, you know, keep on coming back to kind of the promise of digital services. Can it be done? Can it be not? And you know, I can only say we don't know, but we better research it and we start looking at it and actually monitoring. Something that I find striking is that slowly we're getting actually really good, rigorous evidence on whether SMS are very good. And that's actually part of our problem, maybe not the same problem as Nick is describing, but it comes back to a little bit, is that we're very good at explaining the things that were very novel about 10 to 5 years ago. And so actually seeing whether we can be ahead of the curve on some of these things will be great. But I think one of the things that was a common theme in all what everybody was saying is the importance of political economy. Emily was generally emphasizing general, and that's always been with trade, isn't it? That political economy is never very far away. I'm just very struck, like in the African context, I remember a conversation I had with Chiedo Osakwe, who was the chief negotiator for the African Free Trade trade area, and he was actually also working on the Nigeria side, and telling me in despair, actually, and that's why I want to comment on the Nigeria thing, is that actually saying, yes, there is a concern here about certain people owning all these hydrogen factories, but I'm not sure whether it's the concern really about the workers, but it's the concern about the capital owners here. And he named a few names, which I better don't repeat here before I'll be sued. But essentially that we're getting, and that's what keeps on holding it back. And we keep on coming on, and you know, maybe there is actually a time where the politics and maybe the political economy of how people think about it, that needs to adjust, as Nick was mentioning it. Look, it's not the last time we'll talk about trade, but I just want to shall we thank the panel in the usual way. So thank you.